Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a close look at a set of source materials you've shared, all focusing on one thing. The FDA's recent approval of a new Moderna mRNA vaccine. That's mRNA 1283 for the JN1 variant.
That's right. And the sources we're working with here, they include, the actual FDA approval letter, bits from the manufacturer's own info, like the packet insert, some details from this clinical trial itself mention the material, even a reference to a paper on cardiac outcomes.
And there's also a comparison mentioned using VAES data, mRNA versus flu shots.
Exactly. That comparison is drawn right there in the source material we were given. So everything we're discussing, it's pulled directly from these specific documents and notes.
Okay. And our job here really is to unpack what these sources highlight, the key data, the findings, and yeah, some pretty significant concerns raised within these materials about the approval, the side effects, the trial design. We're basically guiding you through what the source creator thought was important.
Think of it as us walking through this specific pile of information, focusing only on what's in this pile.
Right. Let's get into it then. The main event here is clearly the FDA giving the green light to this new mRNA 1283 vaccine.
Yeah, but what the source material immediately stresses is that this approval came despite what the documents themselves apparently report regarding known serious adverse events.
Okay, and the material pulls out specific numbers on that?
It does. It cites the manufacturer's own data, saying 2.7% of people who got the new vaccine in the trial reported serious adverse events.
2.7%. And how does that compare?
Well, the material notes the comparator vaccine in the trial, that's the older mRNA 1273, had 2.6% reporting serious adverse events.
So very similar numbers.
Very similar. But the source material describes that 2.7% figure as, and this is their word, bewildering. They frame it as a concerning rate for a vaccine.
Yeah, the reaction presented in the source seems pretty strong. It suggests that rate is, well, unacceptably high unless the benefit is massive, like for someone near death, which obviously isn't the context here, according to the source.
And another big point of criticism in the source is the trial design itself. They compared the new vaccine, 1283, against the older one, 1273.
Not against a placebo.
Exactly. No placebo group, just vaccine versus vaccine. And the source material really questions that methodology.
Right, comparing one active thing to another active thing. Okay, and the sources also mention the follow-up time.
Yeah, cited from the manufacturer's info as a median of 8.8 months.
And the concern there, raised in the material,
Is that maybe, just maybe, 8.8 months isn't long enough to catch potential longer-term issues. Things like malignancies are mentioned as an example that might take more time to surface.
okay. And then there's that V8 years data point you mentioned earlier.
Right. The source material refers to V8 years data, claiming a massive increase in adverse event reports when mRNA vaccines came out. It specifically states 118 times more reports compared to flu vaccine reporting in VA years. That's the comparison made in the source material itself.
Wow, okay, so recapping this part. The source highlights the FDA approval, but immediately pivots to the serious adverse event rate cited in the manufacturer's data, critiques the vaccine versus vaccine trial design, and throws in that VAERS comparison as interpreted by the source.
Pretty much, yeah. That sets the stage for the specific risks they focus on.
Let's go there now. Specific risks highlighted in the source material. A big one seems to be myocarditis and pericarditis, called a confirmed risk.
Yes, exactly. Inflammation of the heart muscle or the sac around it. And the material identifies the highest risk group as males, aged 12 to 24.
And typically, when do symptoms appear according to the material?
Usually within the first week after getting the vaccine.
And the source mentions something about the severity.
It does. It states, and I'm quoting loosely from the summary, that some individuals required intensive care support. It also notes available data suggests individuals typically have resolution of symptoms within a few days with conservative management. But the source interprets conservative management in this context as meaning, well, likely being hospitalized.
Okay. And the source points to a specific study on this.
Yeah, a paper titled something like Cardiac Manifestations and Outcomes of COVID-19 Vaccine-Associated Myocarditis in the Young in the USA.
And what was the key finding from that paper, as summarized in the source material?
This is quite striking, actually. The summary says that around 5 months after vaccination, follow-up showed that persistence of abnormal findings on cardiac MRI, these CMR findings, described as markers of heart muscle injury, was common.
Common. So, months later, signs of heart muscle damage were still visible on scans frequently, according to the summary.
That's what the source highlights. And critically, the material states that the clinical significance, the prognostic significance of these persistent CMR findings, quote, is not known.
Not known.
Right. The force emphasizes that information on potential long-term consequences, or sequelae, is either yet to be available or just not there.
And this seems to be a major point of concern for the source creator.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The material points out, heart muscle cells don't really regenerate. So damage seen on an MRI is, well, kind of permanent. While acknowledging the long-term meaning is unknown, the source raises possibilities like reduced heart function down the line,
Yeah.
maybe heart failure or arrhythmias.
Even though the long-term impact isn't established yet?
Correct. The perspective in the source seems to be that these heart lesions are being accepted as a risk despite this big unknown about long-term outcomes.
Okay, so beyond myocarditis, the sources also list more common side effects, things described as less severe.
Yeah, but still happening in over 10% of people in the trial. Things like pain at the injection site, very common, like 75% in the older group, nearly 70% in the younger group.
That's high. What else?
Headache, around half of people. Fatigue, also around half or even a bit more. Myalgia, that's muscle pain getting on for half as well.
Yeah.
Then auxiliary swelling, armpit swelling, around a quarter, maybe a bit more in the younger group. Chills, about 24 to 31%. Achy joints, nausea, vomiting were also on the list.
And were these rates different between the new and old vaccines in the trial?
According to the data cited in the source, the incidence was comparable. So based on this material, both vaccines in the trial show these high rates of common side effects.
Got it. Anything else briefly mentioned?
Well, syncope, fainting, is mentioned as a known thing with vaccines generally, not seen as a major concern. And limitations, of course.
Right, like it might not protect everyone.
Exactly. And that people who are immunocompromised, maybe on certain therapies, might get less of an immune response. Standard limitations.
And did the source mention the efficacy claim?
It did. It noted the manufacturer's claim of 9.3% higher relative vaccine efficacy for the new vaccine compared to the old one. But the source immediately follows that by questioning what exactly this efficacy is protecting against, especially with the JN1 variant context.
Okay. So if we try to pull all this together, what's the overall feeling or perspective coming through from these source materials?
I'd say the overwhelming perspective presented is one of, frankly, disappointment and confusion about the FDA's approval. The source material consistently circles back to the risks it highlights, that 2.7% serious adverse event figure. The myocarditis concerns with the unknown long-term outcomes explicitly mentioned the really high rates of common side effects.
Some weighs that against
What it sees as potentially limited benefit, especially given the trial design just comparing it to the older vaccine. The source even speculates, just throws it out there,
Yeah.
about maybe a massive financial interest playing a role.
That's definitely a critical stance based entirely on the specific points and interpretations within these documents.
It is. The argument presented in the source, based only on the data it selects and interprets, seems to be that the risk-benefit balance, as they lay it out, doesn't really add up for approval, especially given that vaccine versus vaccine trial.
So connecting this back to you, the listener, why go through these specific source details like this?
Because it lets you see the ground level. You get a really granular view of the specific data points, the findings, and the concerns as they were actually presented in this source material that triggered this deep dive. You're not just getting a headline, you're seeing the numbers and the arguments the source creator used to build their perspective on this specific vaccine approval.
It allows you to see the why behind the skepticism expressed in the source based on the material it reviewed.
Okay, so we've covered the FDA approval, the cited serious adverse event rate from the manufacturer's data, the myocarditis risk with that crucial unknown long-term significance note from the material, the critique of the trial method, and the overall critical tone.
Exactly. It's a focused look into that particular interpretation and the evidence it puts forward. So maybe a final thought for you to consider, building directly on what's in these source materials we've discussed. The sources explicitly state the long-term significance of those heart scan findings, the CMR abnormalities, and other potential long-term issues is not known. Given that uncertainty acknowledged in the material itself, how do you think about weighing known, reported risks against potential benefits when that long-term picture is incomplete?
And related to that, what does that trial design vaccine versus vaccine, as critiqued in the source, mean for how you interpret the results and the efficacy claims highlighted in the material?
Definitely questions raised directly by the sources themselves. Food for thought.
Indeed.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Always interesting digging into these materials.